Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. Gulf Breeze, Florida, is the kind of coastal place where a normal day can look almost untouched by the rest of the world. Driveways, trimmed lawns, the slow confidence of routines that repeat until you stop noticing them. But on September 8, 2021, inside a home on Jenks Drive, routine gave way to something raw and unmanageable, the kind of private storm that doesn't stay private for long. The official record would later reduce that day to calls, times, statements, and evidence. Yet at its center were human beings, 2 spouses and 3 children, caught in a conflict that spiraled beyond anyone's ability to pull it back. That afternoon, Santa Rosa County deputies would be pulled toward that address again and again, not because of a single sudden emergency, but because of an argument that kept restarting like a door that wouldn't latch. Investigators and later court coverage described 3 separate 911 calls from the home over roughly 6 hours. The first call came at 12:50 p.m., the second at 5 p.m., and the third at 6:20 p.m. It can be hard from the outside to understand how the same household can call for help and then call again and again, how a family can hover at the edge of disaster for hours. But domestic conflict often doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in circles, hurt feelings, fear, pride, exhaustion, and the old arguments that never truly end. Deputies, arriving and leaving, can only act on what they can see and prove in the moment. Sheriff Bob Johnson would later explain the basic limitation in plain terms. If there is no evidence to support an arrest, no clear proof of violence, law enforcement cannot simply take someone away because the situation feels tense. He said the arguments that day were over the children. Colin Turner was 34 years old, a Marine veteran and a father. His wife, Bree Kristen Kuhn, was a U.S. Navy Chief Petty Officer stationed at NAS Pensacola. Those titles, Marine Veteran, Navy Chief, carry a certain weight in American life, suggesting discipline and responsibility, the ability to function under stress. Yet titles don't make a family immune to the kind of emotional pressure that builds behind closed doors, especially when the subject is the one thing many parents fear losing: their children. Investigators said all 3 911 calls revolved around arguments about the couple's 3 children. By the time deputies responded to the first 2 calls, the conflict had sharpened around a plan and a refusal. Turner told deputies he was trying to leave for his parents' home in Georgia with the kids, but Kuhn would not let him. He said she had locked him out of the house. Kuhn, for her part, told deputies that Turner had physically hurt her during the argument, and she said that was why she locked him out. Turner denied any physical abuse. In those kinds of moments, every sentence can feel like a legal document being written in real time. One person says one thing, the other person says the opposite. A deputy looks for injuries, for broken objects, for witnesses, for anything that can be verified. Sometimes the most important facts are not what people say, but what can be supported. Sheriff Johnson, asked later why no arrest had occurred earlier that day, said officers cannot make an arrest without evidence to support it. Turner also made a comment to deputies that would hang in the air as the day went on. He said Kuhn had recently been diagnosed with a personality disorder. The record does not turn that statement into a medical file for the public. It simply shows it as something said during a fraught, documented encounter. But even a single line like that can change how everyone in the room reads the situation, how they interpret fear, anger, and desperation, and how unpredictable they believe the next hour might be. The deputies left. The house remained. The argument did not evaporate just because uniforms and patrol cars were gone. Later, the third 911 call came. This time, it was Turner on the line. According to reporting and investigators' accounts, he told the dispatcher he had been locked in the garage. He sounded calm enough, according to the arrest report described in local coverage. Calm in the way some people get when they are trying to keep the situation from tipping over. Calm because they believe the act of calling for help is a kind of shield. But the call did not end with advice or a promise that officers were on the way. Police said an audible gunshot was heard on the line. Then Turner's voice broke through with words that would be replayed and repeated in the years to come. "She just shot me." After that, police said 3 more shots were heard, and then the line went silent. When deputies arrived at the home, they found Colin Turner dead in the garage with 4 gunshot wounds. The couple's 3 children were inside the home at the time. It is difficult to write that sentence, "children in the home," without imagining what it means in the moments after. Not just the immediate fear, but the way the memory can harden into something permanent. The record doesn't need to describe what those children saw or heard to communicate the damage. The fact of their presence is enough. In the immediate aftermath, Kuhn did not deny that she had fired the shots. Court reporting says she told the first officers who arrived, "I shot him. I just shot my husband." Shocked state, saying lines that included, "I'm a murderer. You should arrest me. I killed my husband. Hopefully I just shot him. Maybe he's not dead. He should not be dead." Those statements, part confession, part disbelief, tell their own story about what happens when a person realizes they cannot undo what they have done. There are moments in some crimes where the suspect runs, where the story becomes a chase. Here, at least as reflected in the early reporting and trial coverage, the first story was not flight. It was shock and an admission that did not wait to be pulled out with questions. Kuhn was arrested that night and charged with premeditated first-degree murder. The state attorney's office, in early coverage, said the charge was centered on substantial evidence of a conscious decision to kill. That phrase, conscious decision, is not the language of emotion. It is the language of law, meant to separate an impulsive act from one the state argues involved deliberation and intent. State Attorney Mark Alderman described the circumstances and physical evidence as indicating a conscious decision to kill. Kuhn was held without bond, and she remained in jail from the time of her arrest through the later proceedings. Outside the courtroom and the jail, life did what it always does after a catastrophe. It reorganized around the absence. A husband and father was gone. A wife and mother faced the rest of her life in the criminal justice system. And 3 children, still needing school, food, comfort, someone to tuck them in, were now living in the crater left behind. The legal process moved slowly, as it often does in homicide cases, with hearings, motions, and the long wait for a trial date. Then, in September 2024, 3 years after the shooting, the case came to a jury trial in Santa Rosa County Court. The trial lasted 4 days. At trial, the basic shape of that September day returned in a more formal, more carefully measured form. Court reporting described how jurors were shown body cam footage connected to 2 of the 3 911 calls. They heard about the argument centered on the children, about Turner's wish to leave for his parents' home in Georgia with the kids, and about Kuhn's actions locking him out. They heard, too, about the final 911 call, with Turner reporting that he was locked in the garage and the dispatcher hearing the first shot, then Turner's words, then additional shots, then silence. Medical evidence also became part of the story the jury had to weigh. Dr. Deanna Oleski, a medical examiner, testified about 4 gunshot wounds to Colin Turner, saying they entered through his back and exited through his chest. This detail matters in a courtroom not because it adds drama, but because it speaks to positioning, where someone was, how they moved, whether they were facing toward or away from the shooter. Juries in homicide trials are often asked to do a strange kind of reconstruction, taking fragments of sound and science, and trying to rebuild a moment they can never truly see. Kuhn's defense, as described in trial coverage, centered on self-defense. She admitted shooting Turner, but told officers she acted in self-defense. In that account, she said Turner wanted to take the children and leave, and she was blocking him from entering the home. She said he kicked her foot, and she fired. The case also included an attempt to use a particular legal framework, sometimes raised in domestic violence contexts, battered spouse syndrome. Kuhn's attorney filed a notice of intent to rely on a battered spouse syndrome defense. But plan fell apart after testimony from Kuhn's brother, Eric, and ultimately Kuhn chose not to testify. Without the defendant's testimony, the defense could not call a psychological expert to testify about examinations in the way they had anticipated, and so the defense rested its case. Trials often turn on moments that, to non-lawyers, might seem like technicalities, but they are not mere procedure. They are the guardrails of evidence. A jury is supposed to decide based on admissible testimony and exhibits, not on impressions or rumors. When a defendant does not testify, jurors are instructed not to treat that choice as proof of guilt. Still, in the human mind, silence can feel like a vacuum begging to be filled, and defense teams have to make painful strategic calls about what risks they can accept. Another witness was Hardy Joyner, described as Kuhn's ex and the father of her daughter, who testified about texts he had exchanged with the victim about Kuhn on the day of the incident. Even that small detail hints at the complicated web that often surrounds family life. Blended parenting, past relationships, the way conflict can involve more than two people, even if only two are in the room when things break. When the trial reached its end, the jury deliberated for a little more than 4 hours. Then came the verdict. Bree Kristen Kuhn, 37, was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Colin James Turner. Local reporting also stated a jury found her guilty after the 4-day trial. After the verdict, the judge moved directly into the penalty phase, and Kuhn was sentenced to life in prison. In the language of law, that is a clean ending, verdict, sentence, closure. In real life, it is not closure. It is a door shutting on one future and forcing everyone left behind to live inside the future that remains. Colin Turner's parents read victim impact statements before the sentencing. The record of that moment is a reminder that criminal cases are not only about what a defendant did, they are also about what a victim was and what the family must carry afterward. A parent does not measure loss in statutes or charges. A parent measures it in birthdays that will never happen, in phone calls that will never be answered, in the strange pain of having memories that no longer have anywhere to go. Sheriff Bob Johnson, in local coverage from the period after the shooting, described Kuhn's demeanor as shock, summing up the abrupt collapse of a life in one blunt line. You're a Navy chief one day, and the next day you're in jail. It is a statement that doesn't excuse anything. It simply names the whiplash of consequences, the speed with which a person can fall from stability into confinement. Yet even as the legal record tells us what happened, it cannot fully translate the intimate terror of those hours on September 8, 2021. A garage door, a locked space, a phone line open to a dispatcher's ear. The hope, perhaps, that help would arrive in time. And then the sounds that ended the call and ended a life. If you try to understand this case only through the final act, it can start to feel like a story about a single violent decision. But if you step back, it also becomes a story about escalation, about systems that can respond to a call but cannot always prevent the next one, about how arguments over children can become existential, each parent feeling they are fighting for their own survival as a parent, not just negotiating logistics. Investigators said the 3 calls were all tied to arguments about the children. It is also a story about the limits of hindsight. After tragedies, people search for the moment when the outcome could have been changed. The first call, the second call, the decision to leave, the decision to lock a door, the decision to pick up a phone, the decision to pick up a weapon. The sheriff's office was asked directly why no arrest was made earlier that day if there were red flags. And Sheriff Johnson's answer was that without evidence supporting an arrest, officers could not make one. That does not satisfy the ache people feel when they want prevention instead of response. But it reflects a hard boundary in how the system is designed to operate. The case of Colin Turner has a cruel structure. It begins not with secrecy, but with calls for help. It includes documentation, body cam video, recorded dispatch audio, official reports. The victim's last moments are not a mystery hidden in a dark corner. They are, in part, preserved because he did what so many people are advised to do in a domestic crisis. He reached out to emergency services. And still, the outcome was irreversible. In court, the defense pointed towards self-defense and a claim of abuse-related trauma, and the prosecution pointed toward premeditation and a conscious decision. A jury listened, watched, and weighed what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Their verdict said, in the language the law recognizes, that the state had met its burden, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. What remains, beyond the verdict and the sentence, are the human consequences that cannot be filed away. The children who were in that house on Jenks Drive will grow up with a story that began before they had any control over it. A family in Georgia, Turner's parents, the ones he had wanted to reach, must live with the knowledge that he tried to get out, tried to call, tried to survive. And Kuhn, once a Navy chief petty officer, will live her life under the weight of her own recorded words, admitting she shot her husband, alongside the jury's decision that it was not justified. In the end, the case does not offer a comfortable lesson, because comfortable lessons require clean moral lines and obvious turning points. This case offers something harsher, the reminder that a family can be unraveling in plain sight, that help can be requested and still arrive too late, and that a few minutes in one enclosed space can reorder multiple lives forever. The record tells us the measurable truths, the times of the calls, the location, the number of shots heard, the outcome in court. The rest, the private fears, the final regrets, the long years the children must navigate, belongs to the people who lived it, and to the silence that follows when a 911 line goes dead. Story 2. The morning of Wednesday, March 12, 2025, arrived in Houston the way it often does in late winter. Quietly, with pale sunlight pressing through the live oaks and a mild chill still clinging to the air. In the Oak Forest Manor neighborhood of northwest Houston, an upscale gated community lined with manicured lawns and modest brick homes, the streets were largely still. Neighbors were beginning their routines, children were getting ready for school, and the city was stirring itself awake with the unhurried rhythm of an ordinary weekday. Nobody who lived on Emma Forest Street that morning had any reason to believe the day would be anything other than ordinary. And then, just before 7:30 in the morning, everything changed. A call came into the Houston Police Department, a welfare check, described vaguely as a suspicious event, at a residence in the 5100 block of Emma Forest Street. Officers responded within minutes. When they arrived at the home, they found something that stopped them cold. Standing in the doorway of the house was a man, 34-year-old Chance Zane Chavez, with his hands raised in the air. He was not running. He was not hiding. He simply stood there, hands up, in a posture that was somewhere between surrender and shock. But it was what covered him that told the real story before a single word was spoken. His arms, his legs, his clothing, all of it was drenched in blood. Officers secured Chance Chavez and placed him in the back of a patrol car. He was, by accounts, incoherent, barely capable of a coherent response, his eyes glazed, his body seemingly drained of something more than just composure. While one team dealt with the man outside, others moved through the front door and into the home, calling out, searching. They moved down the hallway. They opened doors. And then, in one of the bedrooms, they found her. Kristen Chavez, 32 years old, lay unresponsive on the bedroom floor. Paramedics were called immediately, but there was nothing to be done. She had suffered devastating blunt force trauma to her body. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The room around her told a story of unimaginable violence. There were holes punched into the walls, the drywall shattered and caved in, signs of the raw, terrible force that had been unleashed in that space. And there, near her body, split cleanly in two from the force of repeated impact, lay a clothing iron. It was not a weapon anyone would have expected. It was not a knife or a firearm. It was the kind of object that sits on an ironing board in a corner of every ordinary home. The kind of object nobody fears, nobody thinks about. And yet, according to investigators, Chance Chavez had picked it up and used it to strike his wife, Kristen, repeatedly, until it broke apart from the force of the blows. The iron, split in two, became the silent and devastating centerpiece of the Harris County murder investigation that would follow. To understand how devastating this loss truly was, one must first understand who Kristen Chavez was. She was not a statistic. She was not simply a name on a police report. She was a woman of extraordinary warmth and ambition, someone who seemed to carry a kind of quiet light wherever she went. Born and raised in the Houston area, Kristen had built a life anchored in purpose and compassion. She worked as a paralegal, bringing her sharp, analytical mind to the world of law. But it was only the beginning of what she intended to accomplish. She dreamed of becoming an attorney, of walking into courtrooms, of advocating for people who needed a voice. Those who knew her said she was already halfway there in spirit. Her mother, Laura Bell, would later speak of her daughter with the kind of careful, trembling tenderness that belongs only to a grieving parent trying to hold the memory of someone they loved in exactly the right words. She was very logical, Bell said. She was the voice of reason. She was headstrong in a positive way. She described Kristen as someone who could walk into any room and draw people to her effortlessly, not through performance or pretense, but through something genuine and rare, a natural ability to connect. She was very ambitious, Bell added. Loved to help people. Very outgoing. She never met a stranger. Always had a positive attitude. Her brother, Devin Cervantes, described her in the way that only a sibling can, with the kind of love that is also laced with grief so deep it has no clean bottom. She was my ride or die, he said. She was my goofy twin. She always had a passion for others, helping others. His sister Julia Green put it even more simply. As a big sister, she was my role model. These were not the rehearsed platitudes of people performing grief. These were the words of a family trying to describe, with ordinary language, someone who was anything but ordinary. Kristen also had 4 dogs, and in the absence of children, they were everything to her. Her family would later describe them as her babies, and that word carried real weight. Those dogs were not pets in the casual sense. They were companions, beloved and irreplaceable. One was a 10-year-old dachshund named Peaches, small, elderly, and devoted to her owner in the way that only old dogs can be. The dogs were an extension of Kristen's nurturing spirit, of her capacity to love without condition, which is why what happened in the hours before the killing carries its own particular cruelty. In the dark hours before dawn on March 12th, before the police arrived, before the neighborhood stirred, Chance Chavez allegedly took those 4 dogs, Kristen's babies, including little Peaches, drove to the Katy Freeway, one of the busiest and most dangerous stretches of highway in all of Houston, and abandoned them on the side of the road. He left them there, small and frightened in the darkness beside the roar of highway traffic, and drove away. It is difficult to know with certainty what that act meant in the larger unfolding of that night. But it reads, in hindsight, like the deliberate dismantling of everything that mattered to Kristen, the removal of the living creatures she loved most before the unthinkable act that followed. 3 of the 4 dogs were eventually found, thanks to an extraordinary outpouring of help from strangers who saw the story spreading across social media and mobilized immediately. But Peaches, old, small, and unable to fend for herself on a highway, was found dead. A 10-year-old dog named after a fruit, a tiny life that had been Kristen's companion for years gone. It feels like a nightmare, Devin Cervantes would later say, and the word nightmare barely touched the edges of it. As investigators combed through the evidence at Emma Forrest Street and built their case against Chance Chavez, a picture began to emerge of a marriage that had been quietly, painfully deteriorating for some time. Kristen's mother, Laura Bell, spoke carefully but honestly about what she had known. Even though it was not a good situation, Bell said, she was staying in it, hoping that things will change. Those words carry enormous weight. They describe a dynamic that is heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who understands the psychology of domestic violence. The hope that love is enough to fix what is broken, the belief that staying might somehow lead somewhere better, the gradual erosion of safety that happens so slowly that it becomes the new normal before one has time to name it. Devin Cervantes offered another piece of the portrait. She tried to see the good in people even though they tried to take advantage of that. It is the kind of characteristic that defines the best kind of person, the kind who extends grace, who leans toward believing in the redeemability of others. In Kristen's case, it appears that quality, beautiful and genuine as it was, may have kept her tethered to a relationship long after the warning signs had appeared. She wanted to help. She wanted to believe. She was the voice of reason in every room she entered, and yet, when it came to her own safety, reason may have been harder to apply. The arrest of Chance Zane Chavez on the morning of March 12th was swift and without resistance. He was charged with murder in the 176th State District Court of Harris County. He was booked into the Harris County Jail, and in his initial probable cause hearing, which he did not even physically attend, the state requested a bond of $500,000. The magistrate, noting that Chavez had no prior criminal history on record, set the bond at $250,000. That decision sent immediate shockwaves through Kristen's family and the wider community that had begun following the case. There was also another detail that emerged from that early hearing, one that added a layer of complexity and unease to the proceedings. Chance Chavez had been placed in the mental health unit of the Harris County Jail, meaning his psychological state was being monitored and evaluated. He had arrived at the jail incoherent. Whether that state reflected genuine mental illness, the aftermath of violence, or something else entirely was not yet clear. But it was enough to mark his case as one that would require careful navigation through the legal system. The response from the public was immediate and fierce. An online petition was launched demanding that Chavez's bond be raised, and that prosecutors seek the maximum possible sentence if he was convicted. Within days, more than 8,000 people had signed it. Strangers who had never met Kristen Chavez, but who felt the weight of her story the moment they encountered it. The petition became a kind of communal act of grief, a refusal by the public to allow what had happened on Emma Forrest Street to be processed quietly and efficiently through a legal machine without the full force of human attention bearing down on it. Laura Bell, Kristen's mother, spoke directly to that energy. "We're hoping that he remains in jail until the trial, and throughout the trial for him to be held accountable for what he's done," she said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of a mother who had lost her child to violence and was now navigating the bewildering terrain of the justice system. "That's the primary goal right now." On March 17, 2025, Chance Chavez was brought before a judge for his district court appearance. In a moment that further alarmed his wife's family and many observers, Chavez initially refused to appear in the courtroom. A containment squad from the jail eventually had to escort him inside forcibly. The hearing, which had been delayed for hours, concluded with the judge increasing his bond from $250,000 to $500,000. A partial victory for those who had hoped for no bond at all, or for the original prosecution request to be honored. Kristen's family had hoped for more. They had hoped that the man who stood accused of ending her life with a household iron in their shared bedroom would remain behind bars without question until he faced trial. That the legal system moved with its characteristic caution, accounting for procedures, precedents, and the rights of the accused, was something they understood on an intellectual level, even as it scraped against the raw wound of what they had just endured. For him to be held accountable for what he's done, that's the primary goal right now, Bell repeated. Beyond the courtroom proceedings, Kristen's family turned their grief outward into something that might help other people. They began speaking publicly not just about Kristen herself, but about the broader reality of domestic violence. The way it hides in plain sight, the way it is sustained by hope and silence, and the weight of love that has curdled into something dangerous. You need to get out and do your best to seek help and separate from that before it becomes too late, one family member said, addressing anyone who might be in a situation like the one Kristen had found herself in. It is a message that demands to be heard, because Kristen Chavez was not naive. She was not someone who failed to understand danger. She was a sharp, ambitious, deeply empathetic woman who worked in the law, who was surrounded by people who loved her, who had every reason and resource to leave, and who stayed, because that is what millions of people in difficult relationships do every day around the world, in the quiet hope that love will be enough. The tragedy of Kristen Chavez is not about weakness. It is about the terrifying complexity of intimate partner violence, which ensnares people of all kinds: the logical, the strong, the brilliant, the loved. As of early 2026, the case against Chance Zane Chavez continues to move through the Harris County court system. The legal process is slow by design, built to be thorough, to weigh evidence carefully, to extend due process even to those accused of the gravest crimes. Kristen's family waits. The community that gathered around her story waits. The 8,000 strangers who signed a petition in her name wait. Justice, in its formal legal sense, has not yet been delivered. But in a different sense, in the sense of a life remembered fully, of a person seen and honored in the wholeness of who she was, it has already begun. What remains, and what will always remain, is the story of Kristen Chavez as her family tells it. A woman who walked into rooms and drew people to her. A paralegal who dreamed of being an attorney. A big sister who was her siblings' role model and best friend. A woman who loved 4 small dogs with the devotion of a mother. A person who tried again and again to see the good in everyone, who gave her love generously and who deserved, in every possible measure, to have that love returned and protected. She was 32 years old. She had her whole life in front of her: law school, courtrooms, decades of advocacy and laughter and growth and love. She was becoming the woman she had always been working toward. Her greatest thing was learning and just growing and evolving into the woman she wanted to be, her mother said. That woman deserved the chance to become everything she was reaching for. The fact that she did not, that her life was taken in a bedroom on an ordinary Wednesday morning by someone who should have been her protector, is the wound at the center of this story. It does not heal neatly. It does not resolve into anything clean or comfortable. It simply sits there, as the truth of violent loss always does. Heavy, irreversible, and demanding to be looked at directly without flinching, so that Kristen Chavez is never reduced to a headline, never forgotten as a person, and never allowed to become merely a cautionary tale when she was, above all else, a life. Story 3. On a cold November morning in 2016, the Walker House in the Sterky Hills neighborhood of Knoxville, Tennessee, was still and quiet, the way homes often are just before the alarm clocks ring. Outside, the lawn sloped gently down toward the street, and the sky was pale, the first light of day pushing through the darkness. Inside, in a bedroom painted with the soft touches of a teenage girl's life, 16-year-old Emma Jane Walker lay under her covers, seemingly asleep. Her mother, Jill, moved through the routine of an ordinary school day. Emma was a junior at Central High School, a cheerleader who lived for Friday night lights, friends, and the simple rituals of adolescence. Cheer practice, games, sleepovers, the flutter of social media notifications, these were the rhythms of her life. She was bright, caring, and loved deeply by her family, the kind of girl whose laughter could easily fill a room. Jill climbed the stairs to wake her daughter. At first, there was nothing unusual in the stillness of the room. Emma was not an early riser by choice. It was common enough for her to sleep soundly until someone nudged her awake. Jill stepped closer to the bed and called her name. Emma did not stir. She tried again, this time reaching out, shaking her lightly. There was no response. Something in the silence changed, became heavy and wrong. Jill looked more closely at her daughter's face, at the way her body lay. Then she saw it, the unnatural stillness, the absence of breath. Panic surged through her. She called 911 to report what she believed, in that first stunned moment, might be a tragic suicide. Paramedics and deputies were dispatched to the house, unaware that what awaited them was not a self-inflicted wound, but the aftermath of a calculated attack carried out from the darkness outside. When the first officer stepped into Emma's bedroom, he noticed something that did not fit. On the wall near her bed, There was a small, ragged hole, its edges splintered in the way that plaster breaks under sudden force. A second hole appeared nearby, at shoulder height. It did not take long for the truth to assert itself. These were not marks of wear or accident. They were bullet holes. 2 shots had been fired into Emma's bedroom from outside the house, aimed precisely at the space where her bed stood. One bullet had buried itself in her pillow. The other had entered the side of her head, just behind her left ear. Emma Walker, 16 years old, had been killed in her sleep. The Walker home, once a safe haven filled with family photographs and cheerleading beaux, became a crime scene. To understand how violence found its way into that quiet bedroom, you have to go back to where Emma's story entwined with someone else's, a boy named William Riley Gall. Emma and Riley had started dating in high school. She was the cheerleader. He was the football player, a wide receiver at Central High who later went on to play at Maryville College. From the outside, they looked like a classic young couple, the kind people described with words like perfect or quintessential. Their photos showed smiles, matching school colors, arms wrapped around each other at games. But underneath that glossy image, their relationship was rocky, often marked by control, tension, and emotional swings that left Emma's friends and family uneasy. Over time, Riley's behavior became increasingly possessive. He sent constant messages, demanded reassurance of her love, grew jealous and angry if she did not respond quickly enough or spent time with others. Emma's friends noticed the way he seemed to dominate her attention and mood. They worried about how he spoke to her, about how upset she seemed after some of their arguments. What might have begun as intense teenage infatuation slowly darkened into something more suffocating. After nearly 2 years of this turbulent relationship, Emma began to pull away. She was only 16, but she understood, perhaps more with her heart than with words, that the way she was being treated was not healthy. The arguments, the pressure, the constant emotional whiplash were wearing her down. She broke up with him. For many teenagers, a breakup is painful but survivable. Friends rally, time passes, new routines form. But for Riley Gall, the end of the relationship seems to have been something he could not accept. His messages did not stop. He continued reaching out, alternating between pleading and anger. He talked about how much he needed her, how wrong she was to leave, how he would do anything to win her back. To Emma and the people who loved her, it felt less like romance and more like pressure, a refusal to respect her decision. The breakup that should have been a step toward safety became, instead, the beginning of something far more dangerous. In mid-November 2016, the weeks after the breakup, a series of strange and unsettling events began to unfold around Emma. On November 18th, she received an anonymous message telling her to leave her house and come outside. The message warned that someone she cared about was in danger. Disturbed but concerned, Emma went out into the neighborhood. There, she found Riley lying on the ground near a ditch, seemingly unconscious. When he came to, he told her that he had been kidnapped, that people had taken him, hurt him, and dumped him there. He asked her to help him. To Emma's friends, the whole episode felt staged, like a scene in which Riley cast himself as the victim needing rescue. They would later testify that she was frightened and angry, that she did not believe his story. The anonymous messages, the dramatic discovery in the ditch, it all seemed like a manipulation, a desperate attempt to pull her back into his world. The following days brought even more fear. 2 nights before Emma was killed, a man dressed completely in black appeared near her home. He walked around the neighborhood, then came to the Walker house and banged on the door. At one point, Emma saw him outside and felt a chill run through her. She sent a text to a friend, saying that she was scared, that she felt like something terrible was going to happen. "I'm honestly scared I'm going to die," she wrote. It was the kind of message that might sound melodramatic coming from a teenager under ordinary circumstances, but there was nothing ordinary about what she had experienced in the days leading up to it. Emma's friends believed, then and later, that the man in black was Riley trying to frighten her, to make her feel threatened so he could reappear as her protector. Prosecutors would argue the same at trial, that Riley staged incidents to create the illusion of danger, planning to step in heroically and win Emma back. Instead, those episodes hardened her resolve. She told friends she was done, that she wanted distance, that she was frightened by his behavior. She blocked his number at times, pulled back further, tried to reclaim her peace. But while she was trying to move on, Riley's plans were taking a darker form. On the night of November 20th, 2016, into the early hours of November 21st, Riley left his dorm room at Maryville College, where he was a freshman wide receiver on the football team. He took with him a 9mm Glock handgun, a weapon he had stolen from his grandfather. Before leaving, he contacted a friend and asked a chillingly practical question. How do you remove fingerprints from a gun? That friend later recalled the conversation, remembering how Riley talked about wiping the weapon with a towel or something similar. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., Riley drove from Maryville to the Sterkey Hills neighborhood, heading directly toward Emma's house. He knew it well. He had stood in that driveway many times, had walked through the front door, had been welcomed by her family as her boyfriend. He knew which window belonged to her bedroom, knew exactly where her bed was positioned inside. The details of that night outside the Walker home are pieced together from physical evidence and later testimony. The neighborhood was quiet, the house dark, the rest of Emma's family asleep inside. Emma herself was in bed, unaware that someone she had once trusted was creeping through the night air toward her window. Standing outside, Riley raised the stolen Glock. He fired 2 shots from 2 slightly different angles, both aimed at the part of the wall where Emma's head would be as she slept. One bullet pierced the wall and struck behind her left ear, killing her almost instantly. The other lodged in her pillow. The sound of the shots did not wake the family in a way that led them to understand what had happened. In some homes, the crack of a gun might have drawn people out of bed immediately, but in this quiet neighborhood, with the noise softened by walls and distance, nothing obvious registered. Riley left the scene and later returned to his dorm. His roommate would later say that Riley had been out for most of the night and returned around 4:45 a.m. somewhere between his departure and his return. He had ended the life of a girl he claimed to love. Inside the house on Sterkey Hills, Emma lay still in her bed, the rest of the night passing unaware. By the time the sun rose, what had happened was irreversible. When deputies arrived, responding to Jill's 911 call, they initially had to consider the possibility that Emma had taken her own life. But the bullet holes in the wall told another story. Lead forensic technicians arrived from the Knox County Sheriff's Office and began moving carefully through the room, documenting every mark and object. They followed the bullet paths through plaster and insulation, out into the yard where 2 shell casings were discovered near the exterior walls. Lead Detective Alan Merritt examined the house from the outside. The angles of the shots, the distance from the wall, the height of the holes, all of it suggested that whoever fired the gun had known exactly where to aim to reach Emma's bed. This was not random gunfire. It was precise. The Walker's home was quickly secured. Yellow tape went up. Investigators moved carefully through the rooms where, just days before, life had been ordinary. They collected evidence, took photographs, and tried to piece together a crime that had unfolded while an unsuspecting family slept. As detectives began to ask the inevitable question, who would want to hurt Emma Walker? One name came up again and again, Riley. Friends, classmates, and family members told investigators about the relationship, the breakup, the controlling behavior that had left Emma upset and afraid. They described the recent incidents, the fake kidnapping, the anonymous messages, the man in black outside the house. In the emotional fog of immediate grief, patterns emerged. When detectives traced calls and messages, when they looked at who had been in her life and how, the thread kept pulling them toward the young man Emma had been trying so hard to leave behind. At Maryville College, where Riley was just beginning his future as a student-athlete, the campus life continued in its usual rhythm, classes, practices, dorm conversations, while detectives quietly closed in. Riley himself was struggling to maintain a facade. Texts and social media posts around that time show him talking about Emma's death, expressing grief, shock, and confusion. He attended her funeral, surrounded by people who believed, at least for a moment, that he was simply another mourning figure. But behind the scenes, law enforcement was already building a case. They knew the shots had come from outside. They knew Emma had been targeted in her sleep. They knew Riley had both motive and knowledge of the house. What they needed was the gun. Riley had stolen the 9mm Glock from his grandfather, who later confirmed that his firearm had gone missing around the time of the shooting. Riley claimed that he had gotten rid of the weapon, that he had thrown it into the Tennessee River. Without that gun, tying him definitively to the crime would be more difficult. Detectives decided to turn to the people who knew him best at college, his teammates and friends. 2 of his fellow football players agreed to help. It was a dangerous and emotional choice, to secretly assist law enforcement in gathering evidence against someone they had once called a friend. Under the guidance of detectives, they wore wires and met with Riley. In conversations recorded by police, they pressed him about the gun, urging him to show them where he had discarded it. They told him they would help him destroy it properly, that they were on his side. Eventually, Riley relented. He led them, not to a riverbank, but to a more reachable spot where the weapon could be recovered. When he went to retrieve the hidden gun, officers were waiting. A minute later, he was in handcuffs. The recovered Glock, ballistics tests, phone records, witness statements, and the physical evidence from the Walker home formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. On the strength of that evidence, a grand jury indicted Riley on 7 charges: first-degree murder, felony murder, stalking, reckless endangerment, tampering with evidence, possession of a firearm during a dangerous felony, and theft. He was just 19 years old. Riley's family posted his $1 million bail. While he awaited trial, he no longer appeared on the football field. Maryville College dismissed him from the team, and his name shifted from sports articles to crime reports. The legal process moved forward slowly, with pretrial hearings and motions. In October 2017, his defense attorney, Wesley Stone, asked for more time to prepare, and the judge, Bobby R. McGee, postponed the trial until April 2018. This delay offered both sides more months to assemble their arguments and evidence. When the trial finally began in Knoxville in 2018, the courtroom filled with people whose lives had been altered by what had happened. Emma's family, Riley's family, friends from school, law enforcement officers, and members of the public who had followed the case. Cameras from national outlets and true crime programs would later replay portions of what unfolded there, but for those present, it was first and foremost about Emma. Both sides agreed on one major fact. Riley had fired the shots that killed Emma Walker. There was no claim of misidentification, no alternate suspect. The central question was why. Prosecutors Kevin Allen and Molly Martin argued that the answer lay in a pattern of obsession and control. They said that Riley, enraged and hurt by the breakup, decided that if he could not have Emma, no one else would either. They pointed to his actions in the weeks before the killing, the staged kidnapping, the man in black, the anonymous messages, as evidence of a manipulative mind willing to play elaborate games with Emma's fear. Those incidents, they said, were rehearsals, attempts to set up a future story in which unknown threats stalked Emma. When he eventually killed her, those earlier episodes could make investigators think of shadowy strangers instead of the boy everyone already knew. They called witnesses who described the deterioration of the relationship, Emma's fear, her statements that she thought she was going to die. They called the football teammates who had worn wires and helped retrieve the gun, as well as Riley's grandfather, who testified that his 9mm Glock had been taken. The forensic evidence spoke, too. Experts explained how the bullets entered the wall at angles that lined up with the position of Emma's bed, suggesting deliberate targeting. One bullet striking just behind her left ear was not a coincidence, the prosecutors argued. It was the result of someone who knew her room well and chose a spot that would be fatal. The defense did not claim innocence in the traditional sense. Instead, attorney Wesley Stone focused on Riley's state of mind. He argued that Riley did not intend to kill Emma, that he was reckless and misguided but not murderous. Stone told the jury that Riley had been trying to scare Emma, to to stage another dramatic incident in which he could then step in as her hero. He was trying to get her attention, Stone said. I'm not saying it's logical. My client was her hero. As crazy and bizarre as it sounds, he was hoping to come to her rescue. According to this version of events, Riley believed that firing into the walls of her house would frighten her without harming her, and he did not fully understand that bullets could pass through walls and hit someone inside. To many listening, this argument underscored, rather than excused, the danger of his actions. The choice to steal a gun, to remove fingerprints, to drive in the middle of the night to his ex-girlfriend's home, to stand outside and aim at the section of wall where her bed was located. These were not the decisions of someone acting randomly. The case was, at its heart, about the gravity of responsibility. Even if Riley's emotional reasoning was distorted, could that lessen the intent behind pulling the trigger? The prosecution insisted that he knew precisely what he was doing, that his actions showed planning, anger, and a willingness to take Emma's life. After days of testimony, including Emma's friends recounting the kidnapping lie and her fearful texts, and after listening to the recordings provided by Riley's teammates, the jury retired to deliberate. They took only about 4 hours. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Family members gripped one another's hands, waiting for words that would define the legal meaning of what had already become an emotional fact in their lives. The jury foreman stood and read the verdicts. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of felony murder. Guilty on the remaining charges, with some counts reduced to lesser included offenses, such as stalking and possession of a firearm during a dangerous felony. Gasps rose from the gallery, audible expressions of relief, sorrow, and finality. Riley, who had been free on bond, was immediately taken into custody. Emma's family held on to one another as a measure of justice finally settled over the room. Judge Bobby R. McGee imposed the sentence required under Tennessee law for first-degree murder, life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 51 years. Riley would be an old man, if he lived that long, before he could even ask the state for the chance to walk free again. Outside the courtroom, Knox County District Attorney Charm Allen spoke briefly, saying, "Today is about justice for Emma Walker and her family. It was not about headlines or the spectacle of a trial. It was about a life that had been cut short and the recognition, by 12 citizens, that it had been taken on purpose. Justice, however, does not restore what has been lost. For Emma's parents and brother, the years after the verdict have been about learning to live in the shadow of an absence. Her bedroom, her cheer uniforms, the photos taped to mirrors and pinned to cork boards, all remain as reminders of a future that never arrived. Her mother has spoken in interviews about who Emma was outside the single-word victim. She remembers her as a vibrant, kind girl who loved her friends, her squad, and the simple joys of teenage life. She was more than a headline, more than a case file. She was her daughter. Experts on domestic and dating violence have pointed to her story as a cautionary tale about warning signs that can be easy to dismiss in young relationships. Constant monitoring, jealousy, emotional manipulation, staged crises to pull someone back, and dramatic swings between affection and anger. Her mother now speaks publicly about those signs, hoping that sharing Emma's story might help other young people recognize when love has turned into control or threat. Riley's legal journey has not ended with the trial. His attorneys have pursued appeals and requests for post-conviction relief, trying to have aspects of his case reviewed. So far, courts have been reluctant to disturb the verdict or sentence, concluding that he received a fair trial and that the evidence of his guilt was strong. While those legal motions move through the system, they do little to change the fundamental facts. Emma is still gone. Riley remains in prison, serving a life sentence. From time to time, new interviews or programs revisit the case, revealing small details. A new angle of a family photograph, a memory shared by a friend, the sound of Emma's voice in a recording. These glimpses keep her real, reminding viewers and readers that she was not just a symbol or a victim in an abstract sense. She was a real girl with inside jokes, favorite songs, and dreams for the future. Her story is painful partly because of how familiar it feels. Many people have known a couple like Emma and Riley, the cheerleader and the football player, young, passionate, intense. Many have seen friends wrapped up in relationships where one person's affection tips into control. What happened in that bedroom in Sterky Hills on November 21st, 2016, forces us to confront what can happen when these patterns are not recognized or taken seriously enough. In the end, Emma's life cannot be defined solely by the way it ended. It is defined by the love she gave and received, by the joy she found in the simple act of cheering on a field, by the friendships she nurtured, and by the family that still carries her with them every day. The house in Sterky Hills still stands. The neighborhood still wakes in the early mornings to the sound of alarm clocks and the quiet rush of people starting their days. Somewhere, cheerleaders still gather at Central High, pulling on uniforms and tying their hair back with ribbons, ready to run out under the lights. And somewhere in all of that ordinary life, there remains the memory of Emma Jane Walker, a girl who should have grown older, who should have had the chance to make new choices, who should have seen her own life stretch out in front of her like an open road. Instead, her story now lives in the retellings, in the hushed conversations between parents and teenagers, in school assemblies about dating violence, in the moments when someone recognizes controlling behavior and decides to seek help. Emma's name has become a reminder. Love should never be something you have to survive. Story 4. There are lives that burn brightly for a time, full of color and laughter and the electric promise of everything that is still to come. Ashley Lauren Ellerin was one of those lives. At 22, she was the kind of young woman who lit up a room without trying, the kind whose dreams felt not just possible but inevitable. She had moved to Los Angeles with a suitcase full of ambition and a heart wide open to whatever the city had to offer. She could not have known, in the weeks leading up to February 21st, 2001, that a man had already decided her fate, a man who smiled at her in passing, who lived just around the corner, and who had been watching her for a very long time. Ashley Ellerin grew up shaped by the restless energy that defines so many young people drawn to California. She had attended UCLA for a time before finding her true calling and transferring to the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles, known to students and industry insiders simply as FIDM. It was a place built for dreamers, for young people who saw fabric and formed the way painters see a blank canvas. Ashley fit right in. Her friends described her as beautiful, fun, and spontaneous, someone who laughed easily, who kept her door open to people, and who moved through life with the kind of ease that made others gravitate toward her. To make ends meet while pursuing her studies, she worked, and she saved, and she planned. She had ambitions to break into the fashion industry, and those who knew her never doubted she would get there. Her world in Hollywood was vibrant. She lived in a bungalow-style home in the hills, shared with a roommate, set amid the kind of quiet, tree-lined streets that looked peaceful and safe from the outside. She had a wide social circle that brushed up against the world of entertainment, not unusual in a city where aspiring creatives and rising celebrities often moved in the same spaces. She had recently begun talking to a young actor named Ashton Kutcher, who was at the time building a career that would eventually make him one of Hollywood's most recognizable names. They were not yet in a formal relationship, but they liked each other, and there was a date planned for the evening of February 21st, 2001, Grammy night, a night when the city would be electric with parties and music and the particular thrill of being young and alive in Los Angeles. Ashley had been looking forward to it. She had a party to attend, a date to go to, and a life that seemed to be opening up like a flower toward the sun. She had no reason to fear that night. She had no reason to suspect that as she moved around her home, perhaps humming to herself, perhaps checking the time and wondering when Ashton would arrive, a man lurked somewhere close. A man who was not a stranger to her, not a shadow from another world, but someone she had seen, spoken to, trusted in the ordinary, unremarkable way that neighbors trust one another. Michael Gargiulo had a face that inspired confidence. He was the sort of man who offered to fix things, to help carry groceries, to chat over the fence on a warm afternoon. He presented himself as the dependable handyman type, neighborly, useful, unthreatening. Prosecutors would later describe how he made a habit of ingratiating himself to the women who lived near him, becoming a familiar and trusted presence before revealing, in the most violent possible way, that there was something else entirely living beneath that ordinary surface. Gargiulo had grown up in Glenview, Illinois, a quiet suburb north of Chicago. He attended Glenbrook South High School and, by all outward appearances, seemed like a normal teenager. But in August 1993, when he was just 17 years old, something happened that, in retrospect, cast a long and terrible shadow over everything that would follow. An 18-year-old girl named Trisha Picacho, a brilliant, popular student who was preparing to leave for Purdue University and study engineering, was found stabbed to death on the front porch of her family's home. She had been returning home late at night when the attack occurred. There was no robbery. There was no sign of physical assault. There was no obvious motive that investigators could identify. Her father, finding her on that porch, let out cries that neighbors said they would never forget. Gargiulo lived just a block away. He was a friend of Trisha's brother. Police considered him a person of interest, but at the time, there was not enough evidence to charge him, and the case went cold. The family grieved. The neighborhood moved on, and Gargiulo, seemingly untouched by suspicion, eventually made his way west to California. He would not be officially connected to Trisha's murder until a DNA match was made in 2003, and even then, the system would not move fast enough to stop what was coming. By early 2001, Gargiulo had settled into a neighborhood in Hollywood that placed him within a very short distance of Ashley Ellerin's home. He made himself useful. He was around. He offered help. And then, with a patience that speaks to something deeply calculated, he began to watch her. Gargiulo had fixated on Ashley in the weeks leading up to her murder, surveilling her home at odd hours, learning her routines, mapping the rhythms of her days. He knew when she came and went. He knew her friends, her patterns, the schedule she kept. Ashley, for her part, likely thought of him the way most of us think of a neighbor who's always around. A familiar face, part of the background of daily life, not someone to fear. There was nothing about him that set off alarms, at least not the kind of alarms that are visible until long after it is too late. February of 2001 was an ordinary month in Los Angeles. The Grammy Awards were scheduled for the 21st, and the city had that low hum of anticipation that surrounds every major entertainment event. Parties were being planned. Outfits were being chosen. Ashley was looking forward to going out with Ashton Kutcher, a date that carried the particular excitement of something new and hopeful. She was getting ready. The evening had every reason to be wonderful. Ashton Kutcher arrived at Ashley's Hollywood home later than planned on the night of February 21st, 2001. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again. Silence. He peered through the window and noticed what appeared to be a dark stain on the floor. Large, spreading, the kind of mark you might make if you knocked over a glass of wine. He assumed she had stepped out, perhaps annoyed at being kept waiting, perhaps already gone to the party with someone else. He felt the mild embarrassment of a man who had arrived late and missed his chance. He left. He had no idea that Ashley was already dead. What Kutcher had seen through the glass was not spilled wine. He saw was blood, that Ashley had already been murdered by the time he knocked on her door, that she was already lying still in the hallway just outside her bathroom while the city moved on around her, while music played somewhere, while people laughed at Grammy parties, while the night wore on toward morning. The following day, Ashley's roommate returned home. What she found would shatter everything. Ashley's body lay in the hallway, still and cold. She had been stabbed 47 times. The wounds were not the work of a panicked, impulsive attacker. They were deep, deliberate, and savage, some measuring up to 6 inches. Her neck had been slashed with such force that the wound nearly severed her head. There was no forced entry, which suggested that the killer either had access to the home or had entered through an unlocked door or window, slipping inside quietly while Ashley prepared herself for a night out. She was 22 years old. Police arrived and the investigation began, but answers did not come easily or quickly. There was no immediate suspect with clear, irrefutable evidence. Gargiulo, the neighbor who had been watching her, was not arrested. The case remained open, filed away in the thick records of unsolved crimes that accumulate in any major city. For Ashley's friends and family, the absence of justice was its own kind of wound, one that reopened with each passing year. Ashton Kutcher, deeply shaken, went to the police himself the morning after he learned the news. He told investigators that his fingerprints were on her door, wanting to make certain that he would not be suspected, that his presence that evening would be understood and explained. "I was freaking out," he later told a jury. He was quickly cleared, but the image stayed with him, the memory of a window, a dark stain, a knocked door that no one would ever answer again. Meanwhile, Gargiulo moved on. He relocated to El Monte, a city east of Los Angeles, and within a few years he had found a new neighborhood, a new set of neighbors, and a new target. In December 2005, a 32-year-old woman named Maria Bruno, a mother of 4 children, was murdered in her home. She was stabbed multiple times, her throat was slashed, and the violence visited upon her body was of a brutality that left investigators deeply disturbed. Her ex-husband found her and called 911, his voice breaking apart on the recording as he described what he had found. Gargiulo was her neighbor. He had been friendly, helpful. The pattern was repeating itself, but investigators had not yet connected all the threads. It was not law enforcement or forensic science alone that finally broke the case open. It was a young woman named Michelle Murphy who refused to die. In April 2008, Michelle was 26 years old and living in a Santa Monica apartment. She had fallen asleep for about an hour when she woke to find a man in the darkness of her room, straddling her, stabbing her in the arms and chest. The attack was sudden and overwhelming, but Michelle fought back with every ounce of strength she had. She screamed. She struggled. She did not stop fighting. Gargiulo, alarmed by her resistance, fled the scene, and in his haste, he left something crucial behind: his blood. When investigators arrived and collected evidence, that blood became the thread that unraveled everything. DNA analysis linked the blood to Michael Gargiulo. He was arrested, and as detectives looked deeper into his background, the full shape of the horror began to emerge. The murder of Ashley Ellerin, the murder of Maria Bruno, the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy, and further back in time, the unsolved murder of Tricia Picacho in a quiet Illinois suburb in 1993. The handyman neighbor, the smiling, helpful face, the monster that no one had seen coming. The trial of Michael Gargiulo in Los Angeles began in May 2019, nearly 18 years after Ashley Ellerin had been murdered in her Hollywood home. The prosecution called almost 250 witnesses. The courtroom was packed, and among the witnesses who took the stand was Ashton Kutcher, now a well-known actor, who described in quiet, measured detail the night he had knocked on a door that would never open again. He told the jury about the stain on the floor. He told them about learning the next morning what had actually happened. He told them that he was freaking out, that he had gone to the police immediately to explain his fingerprints on the door. His testimony gave the jury a human lens through which to see Ashley, not as a victim file, not as a set of photographs, but as a young woman who had been waiting for a date, who had been alive and getting ready, who had deserved so much more. Prosecutor Dan Akerman traced the arc of Gargiulo's method with clinical clarity. How he selected women who lived near him, how he established trust, how he returned in the dark. The defense, represented by attorney Daniel Nardoni, argued that there was no physical evidence directly connecting Gargiulo to Ashley's murder, and that the prosecution's case rested on inference. But the jury listened to all of it, weighed all of it, and on August 15, 2019, delivered their verdict. Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, and guilty of the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy. The same jury later recommended the death penalty. On July 16, 2021, Michael Gargiulo stood before Superior Court Judge Larry P. Feidler in Los Angeles and was formally sentenced to death. It had taken 20 years from the night Ashley died. 20 years of an open wound for her family and friends. 20 years during which the man who killed her had walked through the world as though nothing had happened, until finally, the evidence caught up with him, and then the law caught up with the evidence. But the accounting was not finished. In September 2024, Gargiulo was extradited to Illinois to face charges in the 1993 murder of Tricia Picaccio, the 18-year-old who had been stabbed to death on her family's porch more than 30 years earlier, just a block from where Gargiulo had grown up. Her mother, who had spent decades wondering what had happened to her daughter, spoke to reporters and said she knew her daughter had fought back, too. The case, long dormant, was finally moving toward a reckoning that the Picaccio family had been waiting for since 1993. Ashley Ellerin never made it to the Grammy party. She never finished her degree at FIDM. She never became the fashion designer she had dreamed of being, never had the chance to see where her talent and her warmth and her spontaneous spirit might have taken her. She was 22 years old, in the city she loved, surrounded by friends who adored her, on the edge of everything, and then she was gone. What happened to Ashley is a story about a particular kind of predator, one who hides in plain sight, who weaponizes the ordinary social contract of neighborliness and trust, who selects his victims not with chaos but with cold, patient deliberation. It is a story about how long it can take for justice to arrive, about the years that pass while families carry grief that has no resolution, while cases sit in folders, while the man responsible goes on living. But it is also, in its own way, a story about the courage of a survivor, Michelle Murphy, who fought back in the dark when no one could help her, who bled and refused to stop resisting, and who, by doing so, made it possible for the truth to finally come to light. Her survival set a chain of consequences in motion that ultimately led to accountability for murders that might otherwise have remained unsolved forever. Ashley Lauren Ellerin deserved to grow old. She deserved to see her designs worn, her name known, her life fully lived. The city of Los Angeles, glamorous and indifferent and full of dreams, barely paused when she died. But she was real, and she was loved, and the people who knew her carried the memory of who she was. Beautiful, fun, spontaneous, and full of the kind of life that should never, under any circumstances, be taken away. Story 5. The wind that cuts through Pico Truncado moves differently than wind anywhere else in the world. It rolls off the Patagonian steppe in long, cold sweeps, carrying dust and silence in equal measure, threading through the sparse streets of a town that has never quite shaken the feeling of being at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Pico Truncado sits in the province of Santa Cruz, in Argentina's deep south, roughly 1,200 miles from the capital Buenos Aires, a town built around oil, where the rhythms of life are shaped by industrial shifts and the quiet ambitions of ordinary people trying to build something meaningful in a remote corner of the world. It was in this town, under this restless sky, that a young woman named Johanna Casas had grown up. And it was in this town, on a cold winter morning in July 2010, that her life was violently, irreversibly taken from her. Johanna was 19 years old. She had dark eyes that her friends described as warm and searching, and a natural beauty that had led her toward the world of local modeling, a world that, in a small Patagonian town, represented both aspiration and visibility. She was the kind of person people remembered. Her laughter, the way she carried herself, the particular brightness she brought into a room. She also had an identical twin. Her sister, Edith, shared her face in her childhood but was, by most accounts, quieter, someone who lived a little closer to the shadows while Johanna moved through sunlight. Together, they formed the kind of pair that small towns can't help but pay attention to. For 19 years, the Casas twins had navigated the world side by side, even as their personalities diverged, even as their lives began to pull them in different directions. No one could have anticipated just how violently those directions would diverge. By early 2010, Johanna had ended a romantic relationship with a young man named Victor Cingolani. The breakup was not entirely clean. Breakups in small towns rarely are, where everyone shares the same streets, the same gathering places, the same mutual friends. The particulars of why the relationship ended remained private between them, but what happened afterward was something that neighbors would speak about for years. Within weeks of the split, Victor Cingolani had begun dating Edith, Johanna's twin. The same face, different soul. The family was unsettled by this. Their mother, Marcelina Orellana, was more than unsettled, she was alarmed. She warned relatives and friends that Cingolani was not a safe person, that there was something about him she did not trust. But Edith was young and in love, and she defended him. She was resolute in her feeling that what she and Victor had was real, regardless of the history it carried. Johanna, for her part, had moved on too. She had begun seeing a man named Marcos Diaz, a rough, blunt kind of moniker that said something about his reputation. Diaz was 26, a few years older than Johanna, and by mid-2010, she had been spending significant time at his home. What exactly the relationship between Johanna and Marcos Diaz looked like on the inside would only become fully clear years later, when court documents and witness testimony began to paint a disturbing portrait. According to accounts that would eventually emerge during legal proceedings, Johanna's life with Diaz had become characterized by increasing isolation. He controlled her movements, her time, her connections to the outside world. She had gone from a young woman with ambitions and friends and an open social life to someone whose autonomy was being quietly, systematically eroded. These details would not be known to her family in the spring and summer of 2010. They watched from a distance, perhaps sensing something but not knowing what. The way families sometimes sense a storm without being able to name it. July 16, 2010 was 3 days before Johanna's 20th birthday. In Argentina, winter has settled in by mid-July, and the nights in Pico Truncado are long and cold, the kind of cold that seeps through clothing and makes people move quickly and talk less. On that night, Johanna attended a social gathering with Marcos Diaz. It was the last time many people who knew her would see her alive. Witnesses at the party would later recall that the atmosphere between Johanna and Marcos had not been easy that evening. There was tension between them, the particular tension of two people who have things unsaid, things unresolved. At around 4 in the morning, when most of the gathering had wound down, Johanna and Marcos Diaz left together. They got into his pickup truck. A heated argument erupted between them inside that truck. Voices raised, anger surfacing in the dark, and then silence. Johanna Casas did not come home. She never would. Her body was discovered in a clearing on the outskirts of Pico Truncado, in a stretch of land locals called the Cordon Forestal, the forest belt, a sparse wooded area at the edge of the town. She had been shot. The wounds were fatal. She was 19 years old, 3 days from her 20th birthday, and she had been killed and left there in the cold Patagonian dark. When the news broke over Pico Truncado, it broke like a stone through glass. A small town does not absorb that kind of tragedy gently. People knew Johanna. People knew her family. The grief that rippled outward was immediate and raw, and alongside the grief came anger, and alongside the anger came demands for answers. Who had done this? How? Why? The investigation that followed would prove to be one of the most troubled and troubling in the region's recent history. Police, under enormous pressure from the community, moved quickly, but moving quickly is not the same as moving accurately. The focus of suspicion fell in 2 directions almost simultaneously, and neither direction was handled with the care the case deserved. Victor Cingolani, Johanna's ex-boyfriend and now Edith's partner, came under immediate scrutiny. He had a prior relationship with the victim. He lived in a small town where personal histories were known and gossiped over. Despite the fact that there were witnesses to his whereabouts, despite the fact that Marcos Diaz, the man Johanna had been with on the night of her murder, the man who had been in an argument with her in the early hours of the morning, had fled, had vanished from Pico Truncado entirely and become a fugitive, investigators proceeded with a logic that defied the most basic principles of evidence. Marcos Diaz was gone. He had fled immediately after the murder, which is one of the most potent indicators of guilt in criminal investigations the world over. He would remain a fugitive for months. And yet, in some crucial early phase of the investigation, the machinery of Argentine justice began building a case against Victor Cingolani, the man who had not fled, the man who had remained in the town, the man who had been dating the victim's sister. In June 2012, Victor Cingolani was convicted of murder. A court found that he had been, in the language of the verdict, a willing participant in the killing of Johanna Casas. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. He maintained his innocence from the first moment of his arrest to the last moment of his trial and beyond. No one, it seemed, was prepared to listen. He was led away. A door closed, and in a small, cold town at the bottom of Argentina, a community told itself that justice had been served. But justice, in this case, was a word that would be tested until it barely held its meaning. What happened next has been described, by those who followed the case, as one of the strangest developments in Argentine true crime history, not because it altered the facts of what happened to Johanna, but because it revealed the extraordinary and painful fractures that her death had created within the family she left behind. Edith Casas, Johanna's identical twin, Victor Cingolani's girlfriend, had never believed he was guilty. She had stood by him through the arrest, through the trial, through the conviction. She had watched the court system condemn the man she loved, and she had not wavered. In December 2012, news broke that Edith intended to marry Victor. In prison, the man convicted of her twin sister's murder. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Their mother, Marcelina, was devastated. She sought a court order to block the marriage, telling the judge that Edith did not have full mental faculties, that she was not in a state to make such a decision, that the trauma of losing her twin sister and the pressure of standing by a convicted killer had damaged something inside her. A judge ordered that Edith undergo psychological evaluation before the marriage could proceed. Edith submitted to the evaluation. She was assessed. The evaluators found her competent to make her own choices. On Valentine's Day 2013, in the city where Johanna had been shot, Edith Casas and Victor Cingolani were married. The streets outside the register office told the story of a community in agony. An angry crowd gathered, their grief for Johanna tangled up with disbelief and fury. As Edith emerged from the ceremony, people threw stones and eggs at her. She was pelted by the people who had once shared in mourning her sister. Her new husband was smuggled out of the building through a back door, disguised in sunglasses and a beret, and returned to his cell. Their father, who had already lived through the nightmare of losing one daughter to violence, told reporters that he had lost both daughters that day. And yet the story was far from over. Because while Victor Cingolani sat in prison, his conviction on the table, another case was quietly being assembled, one that would shake the foundation of everything the court had declared to be true. Marcos Diaz, the man who had been with Johanna on the night of her death, the man who had fled, the man in whose pickup truck a witnessed argument had taken place just hours before her body was found, Marcos Diaz eventually faced his own judicial reckoning, and the evidence that the investigation into him produced was not circumstantial. It was scientific. Biological material recovered in connection with the case was subjected to DNA analysis, and the results were unambiguous. The DNA matched Marcos Diaz. This scientific confirmation compelled authorities to reopen the investigation formally and revisit the 2011 proceedings. What emerged during the new hearings was a picture of Johanna's final months that was as heartbreaking as it was clarifying. Witnesses came forward with accounts of Diaz's total control over her, the isolation she had been subjected to, the way her world had been reduced to the boundaries he set for her. The argument in the truck on the night she died was no longer just a piece of contextual detail. It became central to understanding what had happened in those dark, early morning hours on July 16th. Marcos Diaz found guilty of the murder of Johanna Casas and sentenced him to 12 years in prison. The court, in its reconsidering of the full evidence, ultimately also overturned Victor Cingolani's conviction. He had served years in prison for a crime the evidence now clearly pointed away from him. He walked free. But freedom, for Victor Cingolani, did not mean the life he had imagined. The marriage that had shocked the world, that had cost Edith her family's goodwill, and put her at the center of an international storm of judgment and grief, could not sustain itself outside the impossible circumstances that had shaped it. The marriage of Edith and Victor eventually collapsed. Years after the wedding that had made headlines around the world, Edith broke her silence in 2023 and confirmed that they had separated. She said simply that he was in another relationship, and that she was too. What are we left with when a case like this is finally, incompletely closed? We are left with Johanna, 19 years old, almost 20, full of ambition and beauty, and the ordinary human desire to be loved and free and alive. We are left with her mother, Marcelina, who warned about danger and was not heard, who lost her daughter to violence, and then felt she lost her surviving child to grief's most incomprehensible expression. We are left with a father who spoke one of the most devastating sentences in this entire story, that the day his daughter married her twin's killer, he lost both of them. We are left with Edith, who loved a man and refused to stop believing in him, even when the world told her she was wrong, and who eventually had to find out, in the most complicated possible way, what the truth was and what it cost. We are left with a justice system that imprisoned two men for the same murder, with no theory of their collaboration, with two convictions resting simultaneously on the same crime. A circumstance so logically broken that the courts themselves had to confront the reality that something had gone profoundly wrong. And we are left with Marcos Diaz, who had stood across the table from Johanna at parties, who had shared a home with her, who had in those final dark hours taken everything she was and everything she would ever be, and then had disappeared into the Patagonian steppe while the machinery of justice turned in the wrong direction for years. Johanna Casas would have turned 33 in July 2024. In a different life, she might have continued modeling. She might have married. She might have had children who would have grown up in that wide, wind-scoured province, under that enormous southern sky. She might have reconciled with her sister, or argued with her, or sat across from her at a dinner table decades from now and laughed about things that only twins can share. None of that was allowed to happen. Pico Truncado is still there, still perched at the edge of the steppe, still carrying that specific quality of silence that defines towns at the margins of vast spaces. People who were young when Johanna died are adults now. The case is part of the town's memory in the way that tragedies always become, woven in, impossible to separate from the fabric of the place. And in that memory, she remains 19, dark-eyed, almost 20, standing at the beginning of a life that was stolen from her in the cold dark of a winter morning she never got to leave behind. Justice came, eventually, for Marcos Diaz. It came late, and it came at the cost of years of a wrongfully imprisoned man's life, at the cost of a family's shattering, at the cost of a sister's reputation, and a mother's sanity, and a father's grief. It came in the form of a DNA match, not in the form of police competence or investigative rigor, but in the cold, indifferent language of science, which does not have feelings about who it accuses. That is the story of Johanna Casas, not a story of clean justice or tidy resolution. A story of a young woman who deserved to live, a family who deserved truth, and a system that failed everyone involved. Most of all, the 19-year-old girl in the Patagonian clearing who never got to speak for herself again. The case of Johanna Casas remains a landmark in Argentine discussions around gender violence, judicial error, and the emotional complexity of grief. Her name has since been cited by women's rights organizations in Argentina as part of conversations about femicide and the systemic failures that leave victims without adequate protection. Her story did not end with a verdict. It ended, as all stories of lost lives do, with absence, the quiet, permanent absence of someone who should still be here. Story 6. The city of Toronto never truly sleeps. In the small hours of a March morning in 2018, when the streets are dark and quiet and most of its people are deep in sleep, there is still the low hum of traffic on the elevated highways that thread through the downtown core. The Gardiner Expressway stretches west like a ribbon of asphalt suspended above the lake, and on any given night, a scattering of headlights moves along it, commuters, night shift workers, couples on their way to the airport for an early flight to somewhere warm. Nicholas Cameron was 28 years old and full of life. He was the kind of person who made a room feel brighter simply by being in it, curious, warm, and unafraid to reinvent himself. Born in Toronto to two of the city's most respected journalists, Nick had grown up surrounded by storytelling. His father, Bill Cameron, had been a beloved anchor at CBC Toronto, a man whose voice had become part of the fabric of the city's news culture. His mother, Cheryl Hawkes, had built her own distinguished career as a CBC reporter and producer. Nick had inherited their love of language and their instinct for narrative. By 2015, he had already been named one of Canada's best emerging magazine writers, a striking recognition for a man still in his mid-20s. But Nick was not content to stay in one lane. The year 2016 brought another chapter. He enrolled with HackerU, a Toronto coding school, and taught himself web development. It was the kind of leap that defined him, the willingness to start over, to learn something hard, to build a new skill from the ground up. He had a brother named Patrick, a sister named Rachel, a girlfriend named Monica Trekoff, and a circle of friends who loved him with fierce loyalty. He was, by every account, a young man whose best years still lay ahead of him. On the evening of March 20th, 2018, Nick and Monica had plans. They were flying out of Toronto Pearson International Airport on an early morning flight, which meant they needed to leave the city in the middle of the night to make it in time. There was nothing unusual about this. It was the ordinary, slightly bleary-eyed logistics of modern travel. They ordered an Uber, the way millions of Torontonians did without a second thought. It was a decision as routine as locking the front door. Around 3:30 in the morning, a car arrived. The driver was a 23-year-old man named Abdiherd Bisharmussa. He was young and soft-spoken, and on that cold March night, he was doing something that countless young people do in cities across the world, driving for Uber to make ends meet. The barrier to entry was low. There was no formal training requirement, no extended licensing process, no supervised hours on the highway. You signed up, you passed a background check, and you drove. What neither Nick nor Monica knew as they climbed into the back seat of Mussa's Hyundai Sonata was a fact that would later carry enormous weight. It was only Mussa's second day on the job. The night got off to an uneasy start almost immediately. Once on the highway, Mussa took the wrong ramp and ended up heading east on the Gardiner instead of west, in the opposite direction from the airport. He circled back, then suggested a detour along Dundas Street West, a surface road through the city, as an alternate route. Monica and Nick, alert enough despite the hour to realize something was off, told him to get back on the Gardiner. He agreed. Monica would later recall that throughout the ride, the driver didn't seem very confident driving on the highway. It was a quiet, unsettling observation, the kind of feeling that prickles at the back of your neck and that you try to dismiss as nerves. They were tired. They had a flight to catch. The Gardiner was mostly empty. It would be fine. It was not fine. Somewhere in the westbound lanes near Royal York Road, Mussa's phone and GPS unit slipped free from their dashboard mount and fell to the floor of the car. It was by itself the most ordinary of mishaps, something that happens to drivers all the time. But what Mussa did next changed everything. Instead of pulling all the way onto the shoulder or continuing to drive until he found a safe place to stop, he eased the car to a halt with part of the vehicle still partially in a live lane of traffic. He reached down and retrieved the phone. He set it back in the mount. Then he pulled back into traffic. In the fraction of a second that followed, a BMW traveling at full highway speed came up behind them. The driver of the BMW, a man named Joseph Estacion, had no time to react. The collision was catastrophic. The impact crushed the rear left side of Mussa's car, where Nicholas was sitting, and sent the vehicle skidding violently across all four lanes of the westbound Gardiner before it slammed into the concrete median several hundred meters away. Inside the mangled car, Monica was conscious. She had suffered a concussion and other injuries, but she was alive. Nick was not responsive. He had been seated directly behind the driver's seat, the worst possible position for the angle of the impact. The collision had broken his neck and shattered his spine. When paramedics reached him in the wreckage of the early morning highway, they found a young man with a catastrophic spinal injury, the kind that leaves no room for optimism. Nicholas Cameron was rushed to hospital and placed in the intensive care unit. His mother Cheryl, his brother Patrick, his sister Rachel, and his brother-in-law Jason Burns gathered at his bedside. They held vigil through the night and into the next day, hoping for something, a flutter of his eyelids, a twitch of a finger, any signal that the person they loved was still reachable. None came. Nick never regained consciousness. 2 days after the crash, on March 23, 2018, the family made the most devastating decision a family can make. They took Nicholas off life support. He was 28 years old. His 29th birthday was less than 9 months away. In the days and weeks that followed, grief settled over the Cameron family like a weight that never quite lifted. Cheryl Hawkes had already endured profound loss. Nick's father, Bill Cameron, had died in 2005 when Nick was still a teenager. Now she had lost her youngest child. Patrick had lost a brother he had watched grow from a bright, restless kid into a gifted young man. Rachel described the absence as something physical, a hollow, empty ache that accompanied her everywhere. The friends who had known Nick since school gathered and told stories about him, trying to keep him present through the one medium he had always loved, words. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved quickly on the case. Abdihard Bisharmussa was charged with 4 counts in connection with the crash: dangerous driving causing death, dangerous driving causing bodily harm, criminal negligence causing death, and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. The charges were serious, and the family felt that they reflected the weight of what had happened, that a young man's death on a city highway, caused by a driver who should not have stopped in a live lane of traffic, deserved to be treated as a crime. For months, they waited for justice. While they waited, Cheryl Hawkes did not sit still. She carried her grief into action, the way journalists are trained to do. She began to ask questions and demand answers, not just about Mussa, but about the systems that had allowed the situation to exist in the first place. In June 2018, she appeared before Toronto City Council and delivered a presentation that left an impression on everyone in the room. Her argument was simple and devastating. Rideshare drivers had no mandatory training. Back in 2016, just 2 years before Nick died, the City of Toronto had quietly scrapped a mandatory 17-day training course that had previously been required of both taxi drivers and ride-sharing drivers. It had been eliminated as part of a push to make the regulatory environment more welcoming to companies like Uber. The decision had been made without fanfare, without public debate, and without anyone stopping to ask what happens when a passenger gets into a car with a driver who has never been properly taught how to navigate a highway at night. Rideshare drivers should be treated like cab drivers, Cheryl told reporters outside the courthouse, her voice steady and controlled. They're taking money from the public to drive people to places safely, and why they're accepted and why you have to play roulette with your life getting into one is absolutely wrong. The family also launched a petition calling for stricter regulations for ride-hailing services in Toronto, determined to ensure that no other family would have to go through what they were going through. October 2018 brought a blow that none of them had fully anticipated. The Crown prosecutors, after months of reviewing the evidence, announced that they were withdrawing the 4 original criminal charges against Mussa. The burden of proof was simply too high. To secure a conviction for dangerous driving or criminal negligence, they would have needed to demonstrate a pattern of reckless behavior, and Mussa's actions, however devastating in their consequences, had amounted to a series of individual lapses rather than the sustained, willful disregard for safety that criminal negligence requires in law. Instead, the Crown accepted Mussa's guilty plea to a single count of careless driving under the Highway Traffic Act. Careless driving, a traffic offense, the same charge given to someone who drifts into the wrong lane while distracted or rolls through a stop sign. Patrick Cameron spoke to CBC Radio's Metro Morning the morning after the plea was entered. His voice was quiet, but his words cut deep. "It's almost like we're getting a message from the judicial system that Nick's life didn't matter," he said. "That it wasn't really valuable because he's getting charged with the same thing that you would get for driving a little bit recklessly and not hurting anybody. It's basically a traffic ticket." For the family, it felt like a second loss, not of a person, but of the hope that the law could give an account of Nick's life that measured up to what he had actually been. A web developer, a writer, a son, a brother, a man with a whole future in front of him. The legal system had looked at his death and returned a verdict that carried a maximum fine of $2,000. The sentencing hearing took place on December 4th, 2018. It was, with cruel coincidence, the day after what would have been Nick's 29th birthday. Cheryl Hawkes had spent the evening before with a group of Nick's friends, sitting around a table, telling stories about him. She came to court the next morning carrying those stories with her. Cheryl Hawkes addressed Musa directly. She described the highway, dark and dangerous in the early hours of the morning. The large signs posted on the Gardiner warning drivers not to stop in the exit lane. "You created this situation," she told him, "and my son died." She spoke of the Uber app on the night of the crash, how it showed Bishar Musa as the driver of a vehicle with a 5-star rating, how it projected an image of competence and safety that had turned out to be a fiction. She had trusted that app. Her son had trusted that app, and it had cost him his life. Rachel Cameron spoke of living in a world made permanently smaller by her brother's absence. She described suffering from anxiety and depression in the months since March 21st, and of carrying the weight of a loss that should never have happened. She told the court that her life was empty and hollow without her youngest brother, and that nothing she had tried to say or do could fully fill the space he had left behind. Then came Jason Burns, Nick's brother-in-law. What he said next was remarkable not because it was angry, though he had every right to be angry, but because it was something rarer and harder. It was honest and deeply human. He turned to look at Musa as he spoke. "Bishar, I don't hate you," he said. "I wish you worked somewhere else like Subway and had basic training for your job. You took an easy job because it was safe. You wanted to do a good thing, and as it turned out, it was dangerous. And as it turns out, you killed someone we love." He appealed to Musa directly, not as a villain, but as a person with the capacity to do something meaningful. "Tell Uber in Toronto why they need to reinstate driver training. You can do a thing and help change the laws." Before Musa was sentenced, he rose and spoke. "I would like to express my condolences on the loss of your son," he said, addressing Cheryl. "I did not know him personally, and I believe he was well loved among you and will be missed." It was a small, stilted apology, the words of a young man who seemed genuinely overwhelmed by what his carelessness had set in motion. Justice Paul Robertson spoke last. He had clearly wrestled with the constraints of the law he was working within. "I have struggled to structure a meaningful sentence," he told the court, "one that reflects your level of moral blameworthiness, and at the same time reflects the gravity of the offense." He acknowledged the facts plainly. It was Musa's second day driving. He had pulled over in a live lane. His actions had been careless, but in the eyes of the law, they had not been criminal. "There will be no agreement the sentence I'm about to impose is adequate," Robertson said quietly. "No sentence can restore a life." The sentence was handed down. a $1,000 fine, a 1-year driving ban, 2 years of probation, 50 hours of community service, no prison time. Cameron's family sat in the courtroom as the words fell into the air. They had known intellectually what was coming. The guilty plea had already set the ceiling on what punishment was possible, but knowing it in advance did not make it easier to hear. They left the courthouse still grieving, still fighting, still carrying the weight of a young man whose death had been reduced by the machinery of the justice system to a Highway Traffic Act offense. Nick would have turned 29 the day before. A group of his friends had been around the table telling stories. After sentencing, Musa walked quickly out of the courthouse to avoid being filmed. A car was waiting for him. Photographs later showed that the car had an Uber sticker on the front window. He got in the back seat, not the front. The family was not done. In the months and years that followed, Cheryl Hawkes continued to push for systemic change, appearing before city councils, speaking to media, and gathering signatures on a petition demanding mandatory safety training for rideshare drivers. In 2021, Cheryl and Monica Trekoff launched a civil lawsuit, a $7 million claim filed in Ontario against Uber Canada, Uber's subsidiary Razor Operations, the City of Toronto, the company that had sold the BMW, Bisher Musa himself, and Joseph Estacion, the driver of the BMW. The lawsuit alleged that each of these parties bore some share of responsibility for what had happened to Nick on the Gardiner Expressway in the early morning hours of March 21, 2018. The lawsuit was, in part, about money, about compensating a grieving family and an injured young woman. But it was also about something larger, accountability. The kind of accountability that the criminal justice system had been unable to provide. It was Cheryl Hawkes insisting, one more time, that her son's life had mattered, that the chain of decisions that had led to his death, from the city's removal of mandatory training requirements to Uber's onboarding process for new drivers, deserved to be examined and answered for in a court of law. Because that is, in the end, the thread that runs through everything, through Nick's death, through his family's grief, through his mother's appearances before city councils and her impassioned pleas to Uber to take responsibility. It is the thread of trust. When Nicholas Cameron and Monica Trekoff got into that Uber at 3:30 in the morning, they trusted that the system had done its job. They trusted that the driver behind the wheel had been trained, had been prepared, had been equipped to do what was being asked of him. They trusted an app with a star rating and a friendly interface, and they believed that that trust was well-founded. It was not. The city that had shaped Nick Cameron, that had given him a father who told stories on television, a mother who reported the news, a neighborhood full of friends who would gather around a table and remember him, had quietly removed the safeguard that might have kept him alive in a policy meeting that most people never heard about. And a 23-year-old man on his second day of work had pulled over on a dark highway without fully pulling off, and a BMW had done the rest. Nicholas Cameron, writer, coder, son, brother, friend, one of Canada's best emerging magazine voices, never made his flight. He never saw whatever was waiting on the other side of that journey. He died in a hospital bed 2 days after the crash, at 28 years old, having never once woken up to know how much he was loved. His mother made sure the world knew anyway. Story 7. The morning of Sunday, September 4th, 2022, dawned with the quiet promise of late summer across the sprawling plains of Saskatchewan. On the James Smith Cree Nation, a community of about 2,000 people nestled 200 kilometers northeast of Saskatoon, the world was still and silent. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew-dampened grass and the rich, dark earth. Families slept in their homes, scattered across the 3 bands that make up the nation: Peter Chapman, James Smith, and Chaka Stapleson. A similar peace lay over the nearby village of Weldon, a tiny hamlet of 160 souls, its streets lined with modest houses and the quiet hum of rural life. It was a peace that felt as old and enduring as the land itself. But it was a fragile peace, and by the time the sun climbed fully into the sky, it would be irrevocably shattered, replaced by a storm of violence that would leave an indelible scar on the heart of a nation. The storm had been gathering for days, its epicenter a 32-year-old man named Miles Brandon Sanderson. Miles was no stranger to the James Smith Cree Nation. He had connections there through his partner and his in-laws. He was also no stranger to violence. His life was a long and brutal catalog of rage, fueled by drugs and alcohol since the age of 14. His criminal record was staggering: 59 previous convictions for assault, robbery, and making threats, part of 125 charges filed against him over the years. He had a lifetime ban on possessing weapons and was under orders to stay away from drugs and alcohol. Despite this history, and a psychologist assessing him as a moderate risk of violence, The Parole Board of Canada had granted him statutory release in August 2021 from a 5-year federal sentence. By May 2022, he had stopped meeting with his caseworker, violating his parole, and a warrant was out for his arrest. He had been a ghost, a man unlawfully at large, moving through the shadows of the province. On September 1st, 2022, Miles Sanderson reappeared on the James Smith Cree Nation. He wasn't there for a family visit, he was there to sell drugs. His presence was an ill omen, a dark cloud on the horizon. The following afternoon, the storm broke its first barrier. Miles viciously assaulted his partner, Vanessa Burns, and then tried to run her over with their car. His brother, 31-year-old Damian Sanderson, intervened, pulling him away from the scene. The two brothers were a volatile pair. They spent the next day, September 3rd, in a haze of drugs and alcohol, their actions growing more erratic and menacing. They were picked up around noon and taken to a bar in the nearby town of Kenestino. They returned to the First Nation before midnight, meeting up again after a brief separation. At some point during the day, Damian spoke to a woman, his words chilling in their prescience. He and his brother, he said, had a mission, and that people would hear all about it in the next few hours. A witness who saw them later that night, just hours before the dawn, would describe them as drinking and pumping themselves up for something. The mission was about to begin. At around 3:30 a.m. on September 4th, they stole a gray van. An hour later, they made their last known drug sale. The night was closing in, and with it, the final moments of peace the community would know for a long time. The first tremor of the earthquake that was about to devastate the James Smith Cree Nation came at 5:30 a.m. The gray van pulled up to the house of Damian's wife. The brothers were looking for her, but she wasn't there. Inside, Damian's two young daughters were awakened by the intrusion. He looked at them, his words a final, heartbreaking farewell. They would not see him again. 10 minutes later, at 5:40 a.m., the brothers forced their way into another home. Here, the violence that had been simmering within Miles exploded. He grabbed a pair of scissors and lunged at the man inside. But Damian, for a second time, stepped in. He positioned himself between his brother and the terrified victim, telling the man not to call the police. Miles, seething with a thwarted rage, stormed into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and the brothers left. The man, shaken but alive, did not heed Damian's warning. He immediately dialed 911. It was the first official notification the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, received of the unfolding horror. Outside, in the confines of the stolen van, the tension between the brothers finally erupted. A violent fight broke out. The details of the struggle remain locked in the silence of that moment, but it ended with Damian severely injured. He managed to stumble out of the vehicle and flee into a thicket of nearby bushes. There, alone in the pre-dawn gloom, Damian Sanderson, the man who had tried to temper his brother's rage, bled to death. He would later be named the first victim of the massacre. The RCMP would eventually conclude that Miles alone was responsible for all 11 homicides, including his brothers, and that while Damian may have been involved in planning the initial altercations, something had irrevocably changed, turning Miles's rampage against his own brother. Now Miles Sanderson was alone. The last check on his fury was gone. He was armed with a knife and a bottomless well of rage. And he was just getting started. Between 5:59 a.m. and 6:07 a.m., in a furious 8-minute blitz, Miles descended upon 2 homes. He left 3 people dead and 2 more injured. The bloodshed was rapid, brutal, and indiscriminate. From there, he drove to the home of Gregory Jonesy Burns, a man he had assaulted just the day before. Gregory, 28, his mother Bonnie Burns, 48, and 2 children were inside. Miles killed Gregory and viciously attacked Bonnie and the children, leaving them for dead. By now, calls were flooding the RCMP dispatch. At 6:18 a.m., 2 officers from the Melfort Detachment arrived on the James Smith Cree Nation, the first to enter the maelstrom. They found a scene of unimaginable chaos and carnage. 2 minutes later, one of the officers had to leave the first crime scene to respond to a second, arriving there at 6:32 a.m. The attacks were happening too fast, spread across too wide an area. At 6:14 a.m., just as police were arriving, Miles was at another house, attacking two more people. 5 minutes later, he was at the home of his former father-in-law, 66-year-old Earl Burns Sr., and his wife. He attacked them both before stealing their vehicle and fleeing. But Earl Burns was not a man to go down without a fight. Despite his injuries, the retired school bus driver climbed into his old yellow bus and gave chase. It was a final, valiant act of defiance. The pursuit was short-lived. The bus veered off the road and rolled into a ditch. There, the brave man who had tried to stop a monster died. The rampage continued. Miles stormed 3 more homes, attacking 8 more people and killing 2 of them. Thomas Burns, 23, and Carol Burns, 46. He was now swapping vehicles, abandoning one and stealing another, a phantom moving through the community, leaving a trail of death. At 6:53 a.m., he circled back to Gregory Burns's home. Bonnie Burns, who had survived his first attack, was still alive. A woman named Lydia Gloria Burns, 61, a community addictions counselor and first responder, had come to the house to help her. Miles Sanderson showed no mercy. He killed Bonnie Burns, silencing her forever. Then he killed Gloria, the woman who had come to render aid. Her brother, Darrell Burns, would later say his family chose to forgive, but he spoke of the deep-seated issues that plagued remote First Nation communities, problems that would only get a brief window of media attention because of the tragedy. The list of the dead was growing. Damian Sanderson, 31, Robert Sanderson, 49, Christian Head, 54, Lana Head, 49, Gregory Burns, 28, Earl Burns Sr., 66, Thomas Burns, 23, Carol Burns, 46, Bonnie Goodvoice Burns, 48, and Lydia Gloria Burns, 61. All members of a tight-knit community, many of them related to their killer, their lives extinguished in a whirlwind of violence. With a stolen SUV, Sanderson left the blood-soaked grounds of the James Smith Cree Nation and drove 25 kilometers to Weldon. Residents in the small village reported seeing the suspicious vehicle. A first aid kit and a crowbar were stolen from another car. At 8:19 a.m., Miles Sanderson broke into a home in Weldon and killed 78-year-old Wesley Pedersen, his 11th and final victim. At 7:12 a.m., the RCMP issued a dangerous persons alert for the immediate area, identifying Miles and Damian Sanderson as the suspects and warning residents to shelter in place. By 8:20 a.m., as the scale of the massacre became clear and it was known the suspects were mobile, the alert was expanded to the entire province of Saskatchewan. Soon after, it was extended to neighboring Alberta and Manitoba. An entire region of Canada was on lockdown, gripped by fear. Who were these men? Where would they strike next? Police checkpoints sprung up on highways between Regina and Prince Albert. Air ambulances and paramedics descended on the James Smith Cree Nation, ferrying the 17 injured to hospitals, which had initiated a Code Orange to handle the influx of trauma patients. The manhunt was now one of the largest in Canadian history. At 11:45 a.m., the suspect's black Nissan Rogue was reportedly spotted in Regina, 300 kilometers south of the First Nation, putting the capital city on high alert. But the trail was confusing, muddled. Miles was a ghost in the system. The next day, September 5th, brought a major development. The body of Damian Sanderson was discovered in a heavily grassed area on the James Smith Cree Nation. The RCMP stated his injuries did not appear to be self-inflicted, and they began to investigate whether Miles had killed his own brother. Miles Sanderson was now the sole focus of the manhunt, charged in absentia with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and breaking and entering. He was alone, possibly injured, and considered exceptionally dangerous. The search continued for 2 more agonizing days. The prairies felt vast and empty, a perfect hiding place for a man on the run. The alerts from the RCMP continued, a constant, jarring reminder of the threat that still lurked somewhere out in the expansive landscape. Then, on the afternoon of September 7th, came the break. At 2:07 p.m., a report of a break-and-enter came from the town of Wakaw, about 60 miles from the James Smith Cree Nation. A man matching Sanderson's description, armed with a knife, had stolen a white Chevrolet Avalanche. At 3:17 p.m., an officer in an unmarked police vehicle driving on Highway 11 spotted the stolen truck heading westbound towards Rosthern. The chase was on. Police vehicles converged on the fleeing truck. An officer executed a precision immobilization technique, or pit maneuver, making contact with the Avalanche and sending it careening into a ditch on the side of the highway. The manhunt was over. At 3:28 p.m., Miles Sanderson, the man who had torn a hole in the fabric of Saskatchewan, was apprehended. But as officers took him into custody, he began to show signs of medical distress. Paramedics were on the scene within minutes. He was rushed to a hospital in Saskatoon, but it was too late. Less than an hour after his capture, Miles Sanderson was pronounced dead. The man at the center of the storm was gone, and he had taken the full story of his motives and the precise reasons for his murderous rage with him. The preliminary autopsy ruled out blunt force trauma from the arrest, leaving a cloud of mystery over his sudden death. It would take a coroner's inquest to find the answer. Forensic pathologist Dr. Sean Ladham would later testify that Miles Sanderson died of an acute drugs overdose. A report from the Saskatoon Police Service, which investigated the in-custody death, concluded that the RCMP's actions had not caused or contributed to his death. It appeared that in his final moments of freedom, with capture imminent, Sanderson had consumed a massive, fatal dose of the drug that had fueled his life and his violence. His last words, captured on an officer's body camera, were slurred and disjointed, a final, incoherent testament to a life consumed by chaos. He asked about his brother, Damien. "How's my brother?" he mumbled, before his body finally gave out. In the aftermath, a profound silence fell over the James Smith Cree Nation and Weldon, a silence heavy with grief and trauma. The community declared a local state of emergency. Prime Minister called the attacks horrific and heartbreaking. In what would be one of her final public statements before her death, said she mourned with all Canadians. Flags across the country were lowered to half-mast. But for the families of the victims and the survivors, the political gestures were a distant echo. They were left with the immediate, raw pain of loss. They had lost mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters. They had lost their sense of safety in their own homes. The community chiefs called on the federal government to address the deep-rooted issues of violence, addiction, and mental health struggles in Indigenous communities, and for reforms to the parole system that had allowed a man like Miles Sanderson to walk free. In the months that followed, the search for answers and accountability began. The Saskatchewan Coroner's Service announced 2 separate public inquests, one into the 11 deaths caused by Sanderson, and another into his own death in police custody. The first inquest took place over 11 days in January 2024. It was an extraordinarily difficult process for the families, who had to relive the horror in excruciating detail. Jurors heard how Sanderson, unlawfully at large, went door to door, attacking people. An RCMP criminal profiler testified that some victims were targeted because Sanderson held a grievance against them, while others were simply in the way of his murderous mission. The jury emerged with 14 recommendations, and the presiding coroner added another 15. They were wide-ranging, aimed at multiple levels of a system that had failed. They called for better ways to track offenders on the run, more funding for security, and the establishment of a tribal police force on the James Smith Cree Nation, and improved communication between the RCMP and the community. Other recommendations were aimed at Public Safety Canada and the Correctional Service of Canada. The second inquest, held in February 2024, focused on Sanderson's death. It brought the final pieces of the puzzle into place, confirming the cause of death as a cocaine overdose and detailing the final moments of the police chase and arrest. The jury in that inquest made no recommendations, but the evidence presented brought a close to the questions surrounding his death in custody. The story of the Saskatchewan murders is a story of immense tragedy, a chronicle of a system's failures and one man's catastrophic explosion of violence. but it is also a story of resilience. In the face of unimaginable loss, the community of the James Smith Cree Nation came together, demanding change and working to heal the profound wounds left behind. Brian Burns, who lost his wife Carol and son Thomas in the attack, said the inquest helped him sleep better at night, that a weight had been lifted. Chelsea Stonestand, who also lost family, called the inquest a practical step that brought people together to seek and share the truth. The legacy of the 11 victims lives on in their families' fight for a future where such a tragedy can never happen again. A future where the quiet peace of a Saskatchewan morning cannot be so easily and brutally stolen.